I woke up to the familiar sound of birds chirping outside my window, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the blinds. Maplewood had always been the kind of place where mornings began gently, easing you into the day with a sense of peace that I had come to take for granted. I rolled out of bed, stretching my arms, and made my way downstairs, the smell of freshly brewed coffee guiding me like a beacon. As I sipped my coffee on the front porch, I took in the view of our quiet street. The lawns were perfectly trimmed, the houses all neatly aligned with their picket fences, and the air carried that crisp, early morning freshness. It was a scene straight out of a postcard. But something was different that morning. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a slight unease in the pit of my stomach that I tried to shake off. My gaze wandered across the street to Marcus Hale's house. Marcus was the kind of neighbor you'd count on in a pinch, always ready with a spare set of tools or a helping hand. But today, something was off. I noticed a group of people standing still in his front yard, their backs to me. They weren't moving, not even shifting their weight or turning their heads, just standing there, motionless. My mind struggled to process the scene. It didn't fit with the normalcy I had come to expect from Maplewood. I felt a strange pull, like something was urging me to go over and check on Marcus. Maybe it was the sheer oddity of seeing people, neighbors, even, standing around like statues that compelled me. Setting down my coffee cup, I walked across the street. As I got closer, I recognized a few faces. Mr. Thompson from down the block, Mrs. Riley, who always walked her dog past my house every evening. And there, standing among them, was Marcus. Marcus? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response. He just stood there, eyes fixed straight ahead, unblinking. I reached out a hand, hesitating for just a moment before touching his shoulder. It was like trying to wake someone from a deep sleep, but Marcus didn't stir. His skin felt cold under my fingers, and a shiver ran down my spine. Something was very wrong. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The others were the same, completely unresponsive, their expressions vacant, as if they were lost somewhere deep inside themselves. Panic began to creep in, but I pushed it down. I needed to think, to understand what I was seeing. This wasn't just a few people spacing out. There was a stillness in them that was unnatural, almost as if they were being controlled by something or someone. I didn't know what to do. It felt like the whole world had shifted in the blink of an eye, leaving me standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink of something terrifying. I backed away from the group, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Though none of them had moved an inch, my instinct was to run, to get as far away from them as possible. But another part of me, the rational part, knew I couldn't just leave it alone. I hurried back to my house, locking the door behind me, as if that simple act could keep the strangeness at bay. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I had just witnessed. It wasn't long before my thoughts circled back to Marcus. He had always been a curious man, always asking questions, digging into things most of us wouldn't think twice about. Could that have something to do with what was happening now? After pacing the living room for what felt like hours, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed answers, and the only place I could think to start was Marcus's house. I didn't want to go back there, not after what I'd seen, but the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. So I grabbed my jacket and headed out again, this time with more purpose. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual as I made my way to Marcus's front door. The group in his yard was gone, and the house itself looked untouched, ordinary even. I hesitated on the porch, my hand hovering over the doorbell, before I decided to just let myself in. The door was unlocked, which didn't surprise me. Maplewood wasn't the kind of place where people worried about locking their doors. Inside, the house was dark, the blinds drawn. It felt colder than it should have, and there was a musty smell in the air, like the place hadn't been aired out in days. I called out Marcus's name, but the silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. I moved through the house cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. It wasn't until I reached his study that I found something out of place. a stack of papers scattered across his desk, some of them lying on the floor as if they had been dropped in a hurry. I knelt down, picking up one of the pages, and my blood ran cold as I read the words printed on it. Government project. Mind control. Maplewood. The words swam in front of my eyes as the reality of what I was holding began to sink in. These weren't just papers. They were evidence, documentation of something unimaginable. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling, each new detail more horrifying than the last. A government-funded experiment, right here in Maplewood, using the water supply to control the minds of the residents. I had to get out of there. Clutching the documents, I bolted from the house, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of it all. The peaceful suburb I had always known had been nothing more than a facade, hiding a terrible secret. And now that I knew the truth, there was no going back. When I left Marcus's house, my mind was a swirling mess of confusion and fear. The documents I had found seemed too wild to be real. But there they were in black and white, telling a story of government experiments and mind control. The quiet streets of Maplewood suddenly felt like the setting of a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. I needed to talk to someone who could help me make sense of this. The only person I could think of was Laura Hale. Laura had always been a pillar of strength in the neighborhood. She was the kind of woman who knew how to get things done, whether it was organizing the annual block party or lending an ear to a friend in need. If there was anyone who could help me, it was her. But as I approached her house, my heart raced with doubt. How could I possibly explain what I had just discovered? How could I convince her that our perfect little town was hiding such a dark secret? I knocked on the door, my hand shaking slightly. When Laura answered, she looked the same as always, calm, composed, with that warm smile that had comforted so many. But as soon as I started telling her about Marcus, about the strange behavior I'd witnessed and the documents I'd found, her expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by a look of deep concern. She listened quietly as I spoke, her eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "I've noticed things too, Ethan," she finally said, her voice steady but laced with worry. "Marcus hasn't been himself for weeks now. He's been distant, preoccupied, and then he just changed. I thought it was stress, maybe something at work, but now I'm not so sure. If what you're saying is true, then we're all in danger." The weight of her words settled heavily on me. I wasn't alone in this, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. Laura and I spent the next few hours going over the documents, trying to piece together what exactly had happened to Marcus and our other neighbors. The more we read, the more it became clear. The transmitter at the water treatment plant was the key. It was the source of the mind control, and if we could destroy it, we might be able to free everyone. But the task ahead of us was daunting. We weren't dealing with just a few rogue scientists or some small-time operation. This was a government-backed project, and the people behind it wouldn't take kindly to us interfering. We needed a plan, and we needed it fast. Laura suggested we start by gathering more information, maybe even try to find others who hadn't been affected yet. But time was against us, and we both knew it. As we stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the street, I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched. The idea wasn't far-fetched, not with what I had seen that morning. The watchers, as I'd started to think of them, were everywhere. Once friendly faces now turned blank, empty, and somehow menacing. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of them standing right behind me. Laura and I walked through the neighborhood, trying to stay out of sight as much as possible. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every small sound seem amplified. As we passed by familiar houses, I noticed more and more people standing in their front yards, just like the group outside Marcus's house. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, watching, waiting. I felt my paranoia growing with each step, the walls of my once safe world closing in around me. We made it to Laura's house without incident, but the feeling of unease was impossible to shake. Inside, we sat down at the kitchen table, the documents spread out before us. We needed to figure out our next move, but the more we talked, the clearer it became that we were on our own. We couldn't trust anyone, not the police, not our neighbors, not even the government. It was just the two of us against whatever was controlling our town. "I think we need to act tonight," Laura said, her voice firm. "We don't know how much time we have before they figure out what we're up to. If we're going to stop this, we have to do it now." I nodded, knowing she was right, but feeling the weight of what we were about to do. This wasn't just about saving ourselves. It was about saving everyone in Maplewood. The thought was both empowering and terrifying. We quickly made a plan. We would break into the water treatment plant under the cover of darkness, disable the transmitter, and hope that it would be enough to free the town from whatever grip it was under. As night fell, the neighborhood grew eerily quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and distant traffic seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Laura and I gathered what little gear we had: flashlights, a pair of wire cutters, a map of the plant's layout that we had found among Marcus's papers, and set out. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. We stuck to the back roads, avoiding the main streets where the watchers were likely to be. The journey to the water treatment plant was short, but it felt like it took forever. By the time we arrived, my nerves were stretched thin, and I could tell Laura was feeling the same. The plant loomed ahead of us, a hulking mass of concrete and metal, its exterior bathed in the dim light of a few scattered floodlights. It looked deserted, but we knew better than to trust appearances. We crouched in the shadows, going over the plan one last time. There was no turning back now. We were committed, for better or worse. As we prepared to move, I couldn't help but think of Marcus and the others, of what had happened to them, and of what might happen to us if we failed. The fear was almost overwhelming, but I pushed it down, focusing instead on the task at hand. There was too much at stake to let fear get the better of me now. Taking a deep breath, I nodded to Laura. It was time. We slipped out of the shadows and made our way toward the plant, our hearts pounding in unison. The fight for Maplewood had begun, and there was no telling how it would end. The night had fallen heavy and dark as Laura and I crept toward the water treatment plant. Every step felt deliberate, calculated, as if the ground beneath our feet could betray us at any moment. The plant loomed ahead like a fortress, its concrete walls and chain-link fences casting ominous shadows in the faint glow of the security lights. We knew this place wasn't just any ordinary facility. It was the heart of the nightmare that had consumed our town, the source of the mind control that had turned our neighbors into lifeless shells of themselves. As we approached the perimeter, my nerves were on edge, each rustle of the wind or distant sound making my heart race. The fence was tall, topped with barbed wire, but we had come prepared. Laura pulled out a pair of wire cutters, her hand steady despite the tension in the air. I kept watch, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. The plant appeared deserted, but I knew better than to trust that illusion. This place was too important to the people behind the conspiracy. They wouldn't leave it unguarded. With a soft click, the wire cutters bit through the fence, creating a small opening just big enough for us to slip through. One by one, we made our way inside, keeping low and moving quickly across the open ground. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of machinery from within the plant. I could feel the weight of our mission pressing down on me, the knowledge that if we failed here, it wouldn't just be our lives on the line. The entire town of Maplewood depended on us. Inside the plant, the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and damp concrete. We moved through the dimly lit corridors, our footsteps echoing off the cold, hard floors. The layout of the place was a maze, with pipes snaking along the walls and overhead, and doors leading off into various rooms filled with equipment that looked both alien and dangerous. We had studied the map we found at Marcus's house, But being here in person was disorienting. Still, we pressed on, driven by the urgency of our task. Finally, we reached the control room, a stark, sterile space filled with blinking monitors and rows of switches and dials. At the center of it all stood the transmitter, the device responsible for sending out the mind-controlling signal that had turned our neighbors into the Watchers. It was larger than I had imagined, a mass of cables and antennas that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic hum. Seeing it in person, knowing what it was capable of, made my skin crawl. Laura and I exchanged a glance, the weight of the moment heavy between us. We knew that disabling the transmitter wouldn't be easy, if we even had the right tools for the job. We had brought what we could, but neither of us were experts in this kind of thing. We would have to figure it out as we went, and we didn't have much time. I could feel the seconds ticking by, each one bringing us closer to discovery. As we approached the transmitter, a sudden noise made us freeze in our tracks. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, getting louder by the second. My heart jumped into my throat. Someone was coming. We had no time to hide, no time to think. Instinct took over. Laura and I ducked behind a row of consoles, holding our breath as the footsteps drew nearer. I could see the shadow of a figure stretching across the floor, and my mind raced with possibilities. Were they here to check on the transmitter? Had they already discovered our presence? The figure stopped just short of the room, lingering in the hallway for what felt like an eternity. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the footsteps started again, moving away from us, fading into the distance. We waited a few moments longer, making sure they were truly gone before we dared to move. "That was too close," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, still trying to calm my racing heart. We couldn't afford any more close calls. We needed to act fast. I turned my attention back to the transmitter, trying to make sense of the jumble of wires and circuits. We had to find a way to disable it, and we had to do it now. Laura started pulling at the cables, disconnecting anything that looked important, while I searched for anything that looked like a control panel. The transmitter hummed louder, almost as if it were resisting our efforts. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down, focusing on the task at hand. This was our only chance. Finally, I found a switch that looked like it could power down the transmitter. My hand hovered over it for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. There was no going back from this. With a deep breath, I flipped the switch. The hum of the transmitter sputtered and died, the lights on the control panel flickering before going dark. For a moment, everything was silent, the oppressive tension lifting as the transmitter powered down. But our relief was short-lived. Alarms blared, red lights flashing throughout the room, signaling that the system had been compromised. We had succeeded, but we had also triggered a security response. We had to get out now. The footsteps from before returned, this time in a hurry, echoing down the corridor with a sense of urgency that matched our own. Laura and I bolted from the control room, sprinting through the maze of hallways as the alarms continued to blare around us. The sound was deafening, but all I could think about was getting to safety. We burst out of the plant and into the open air, the cool night a stark contrast to the oppressive heat inside. But there was no time to stop. Behind us, we could hear the shouts of the guards, the pounding of their boots on the pavement as they chased after us. We ran toward the woods, the dark trees offering our only chance of escape. As we plunged into the forest, the branches clawed at our clothes and faces, but we didn't slow down. The sound of our pursuers was getting closer, and I knew we couldn't afford to be caught. The adrenaline surged through me, fueling my desperate flight through the underbrush. The forest seemed endless, each step taking us deeper into the unknown. But I clung to the hope that if we could just keep going, we might outrun them. The pursuit felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the sounds of the guards began to fade, their shouts growing distant as we pushed further into the woods. We didn't stop until we were sure we were alone, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. The danger wasn't over, but for the moment, we had escaped. Lying there in the darkness, with the stars barely visible through the canopy above, I couldn't help but think about what we had just done. We had struck a blow against the people controlling our town, but at what cost? The alarms would bring reinforcements, and we had no idea what they would do next. The fight for Maplewood was far from over, and the battle that lay ahead would be even more dangerous than the one we had just survived. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Laura and I lay there for what felt like hours, trying to catch our breath and gather our thoughts. The adrenaline that had fueled our desperate flight was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a deep exhaustion that settled into my bones. The forest was quiet now, the sounds of our pursuers long gone, but the tension still hung in the air like a thick fog. We had escaped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was just beginning. Eventually, we forced ourselves to our feet, our bodies aching from the night's ordeal. We needed to get back to town, to see if disabling the transmitter had worked, if our neighbors were free. The thought of returning to Maplewood filled me with both hope and dread. Part of me feared what we might find, that the mind control had taken an even deeper hold, that the people we knew were lost for good. But we had to know. We had to see for ourselves if our efforts had made any difference. The walk back was slow and silent, neither of us speaking as we navigated through the dense woods. My mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. The break-in, the alarms, the frantic chase through the forest. It all felt like a blur, like a dream I couldn't quite shake off. But the weight of the documents I still carried in my backpack was a constant reminder that it had all been real, that we had uncovered something dark and dangerous, and that the consequences were far from over. When we finally emerged from the woods, the sight of Maplewood in the early morning light was surreal. The town looked exactly as it always had, quaint, quiet, with its perfectly manicured lawns and tidy houses. But there was something different in the air, a sense of unease that seemed to linger just below the surface. As we walked through the streets, I noticed that the watchers were gone. The people who had stood motionless in their yards, blank-eyed and unresponsive, were nowhere to be seen. Instead, we saw our neighbors, many of them stepping out of their houses, blinking in the sunlight as if waking from a long sleep. They looked confused, disoriented, their faces creased with worry and fear. Some were holding their heads, as if trying to make sense of a splitting headache, while others looked around with wide, frightened eyes. It was as if the entire town had been under a spell, and now that it was broken, they were struggling to remember what had happened to them. Laura and I exchanged a look, relief flooding through me despite the uncertainty of what came next. We had done it. We had freed them. But as we continued through the town, I couldn't help but notice the fear in their eyes, the way they recoiled from us as we passed. They knew something terrible had happened, even if they couldn't remember the details, and I knew that the truth of what had been done to them would be a heavy burden to bear. We reached Marcus's house just as he stepped out onto his porch, rubbing his temples as if trying to shake off a bad dream. His eyes were red, his face pale, but he was awake, and when he saw us, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He came down the steps slowly, his movements stiff and uncertain, and for a moment, I feared that the mind control hadn't fully worn off. But when he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. "Ethan, Laura, what happened?" he asked, his brow furrowed with confusion. I remember bits and pieces, but everything else is a blur." Laura stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's over, Marcus," she said softly. "The transmitter is destroyed. The control, it's gone." Marcus nodded slowly, as if trying to process her words. "I knew something was wrong," he murmured. "I could feel it, like a fog in my mind. But I couldn't fight it. I couldn't stop it." "You did more than you know," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. You left us the documents. You helped us figure out what was happening. Without you, we wouldn't have been able to stop it." Marcus looked down, a mixture of guilt and relief crossing his features. I wish I could remember everything," he said quietly. "I wish I could have done more." "We did what we could," Laura said, her voice firm but gentle. "And now, we need to make sure this never happens again." As we stood there, the reality of what we had done began to sink in. We had uncovered a conspiracy, saved our town, but at a cost we couldn't yet fully understand. The documents in my backpack were the only proof of what had happened, and they were our only chance of exposing the truth to the rest of the world. We knew we couldn't keep this to ourselves. If we didn't act, this nightmare could spread far beyond Maplewood. The three of us headed to my house, where we could go through the documents in safety. We needed to piece together the full story to understand the scope of the conspiracy, and then find a way to get this information to the authorities, to the media, anyone who could help us stop this from happening again. But as we sat down at the kitchen table, spreading out the papers and notes, a new fear began to creep into my mind. What if this wasn't the end? What if destroying the transmitter wasn't enough? The people behind this project were powerful, and they wouldn't let something like this go easily. I thought about the technology we had seen, the way it had controlled our neighbors, and a cold realization settled in my gut. If they could do this with a transmitter, what else could they do? What if they had other means, other ways of controlling people? Laura must have seen the worry on my face, because she reached out and touched my hand. "We'll figure it out, Ethan," she said, her voice strong. "Whatever comes next, we'll be ready." But as I looked down at the papers, at the names and dates and diagrams that detailed the horror we had just lived through, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The transmitter was gone, but the threat was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. We had won a battle, but the war was far from over. And as much as I wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that we could return to our normal lives, I knew that Maplewood, and all of us, had been forever changed. The fight wasn't over, and deep down, I knew that it never really would be.